All right, I guess it's noon, so we will get this rolling. Hello, welcome to the first session of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation monthly webinar series. The series is designed to share scientific findings and management initiatives on whitebark and other high elevation 5-needle pine species in the US and Canada, and to foster communication among scientists and managers working on those species. So thank you for joining us. My name is Vlad Kovalenko. I am a master's student at the University of Montana, studying Clark's Nutcracker Ecology in Glacier National Park. And my colleague and fellow master's student, Enzo Martelli, will moderate the question and answer session after Dr. Schaming's presentation. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Taza Schaming. Since 2009, Dr. Schaming has been investigating the impact of the decline of whitebark pine on Clark's nutcrackers. She is studying the stability and resilience of the nutcracker-whitebark pine mutualism to help ensure persistence of these species and the nutcracker's seed dispersal function. Dr. Schaming finished her PhD at Cornell University in 2016 and is continuing her research as a long-term study as a wildlife ecologist through the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. She spends her free time exploring the woods and the world with her 6-year-old daughter, Suneva, gardening, hiking, camping, and canoeing. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Schaming.
Great, thank you. Let me get my talk up. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to assume that you are all experts in the importance of whitebark pine and the current decline of whitebark pine, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. And then, of course, you all know that whitebark pine and Clark's nutcrackers are a fascinating mutualism, where Clark's nutcrackers are obligate mutualists of whitebark pine because the trees virtually completely, if not completely, depend on the birds for dispersal of their wingless seeds. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about background of Clark's nutcracker behavior. And then, because it's so essential for whitebark pine management that nutcrackers are available to disperse seeds long term, I'm going to focus a little bit on management recommendations and considerations that have come to light based on recent Clark's nutcracker focused research. And this will include both my own research and the results from other studies. And then I'll talk a little bit about the two nutcracker projects that I'm working on now. So, as you all know, nutcrackers are forest architects. They disperse seeds further than wind and rodents and all other seed hoarding birds in North America. They're basically an unpaid crew of tree planters. They'll disperse seeds across latitude, they'll disperse seeds across elevation into recently disturbed areas such as recent burns or avalanche areas. These birds are particularly important because they move the whitebark pine genes around. And they're also important in light of current climate change because they are moving these seeds really far. We know from Teresa Lorenz's work in the Cascades that these birds will move seeds up to 32.6 kilometers. She found that birds were moving out of their home range and flying up to 32.5 kilometers away to collect seeds and then bring them back to their home range to cache them. We also know that these birds will cache a lot of the seeds that they harvest near the harvest stands and in other locations that are much closer than this 32.5 kilometer mark. Nutcrackers are also facultative mutualists of whitebark pine and multiple other species of conifer. So even though whitebark pine depends on these birds don't depend on whitebark pine overall, even though in some areas whitebark pine may be essential to their local persistence. On the left is the whitebark pine range map, and then on the right is the Clark's nutcracker range map. As you can see, the nutcrackers spread over a much wider area, and they're also present everywhere that whitebark pine is present. Now, the reason that whitebark pine seeds are so special is that they're huge. They have more calories, more fat per pound than chocolate. If you look at the estimates that folks had done of how many calories a nutcracker would need to survive over the winter, the birds would need about 10,000 whitebark pine seeds. We know that they'll catch between 32,000 and 98,000 seeds per bird per year, which is far more than this 10,000. But we know they need at least that minimum 10,000 in order to survive. And they catch far more because rodents will steal some of the seeds, they'll lose some to germination. Now, if they switch to Ponderosa pine, they would need about 45,000 seeds, or if they switch to Douglas fir, they would need about 200,000. I have two study areas. One is in Wyoming in the greater Yellowstone, and there the main sources of food are just whitebark pine and Douglas fir. Whereas where I work in Washington, they actually have whitebark pine, Ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir, so they have a lot more options. It would be pretty tricky to switch from whitebark pine to Douglas fir. So the big question is, how is whitebark pine decline impacting Clark's nutcrackers? How is it impacting their population status? How is it impacting their behavior? When I started reading about nutcrackers and discovered this system back in 2008, I realized that there had not been a lot of research on Clark's nutcrackers, and there's just a lot that we didn't know. Since then, a lot more has come to light. So I started the Nutcracker Ecosystem Project in 2009 for my PhD, and I'm hopefully going to continue it long-term forever. The more answers I find, the more questions I have. But my main overall questions, like Vlad said in the introduction, are one, how stable and resilient is this keystone mutualism? And then two, which management strategies should increase nutcracker stability and resilience? And to get at these questions, I've been looking at breeding and foraging ecology, home range variation, habitat selection and habitat use, movement and emigration patterns. So there's a lot. So what do we know about nutcracker population status? Very little. Partially because these birds are such wide-ranging species. They have such large home ranges. They are facultative. They're facultative migrants. They'll move over large areas within a region or between regions over many years, not just during times of large, widespread cone crop failures. And they're also poorly captured by the typical survey methods used to study populations of birds. They're very poorly captured in breeding bird surveys and backyard bird counts and some of the other typical large scale, large geographic range citizen science surveys. We do know from Chris Ray et al.'s 2017 paper that nutcrackers do seem to be declining in Mount Rainier National Park, but they don't seem to hold that trend. Or no, they seem to be declining in Mount Rainier, but they seem to be pretty stable in North Cascades National Park. Ray was able to look at data from breeding season point count data over a number of years in these national parks to get this data. One of the problems is that this data was collected during the breeding season of most birds, which is later than the breeding season of Clark's nutcrackers. Plus, at this early part of the year, detectability of nutcrackers is pretty low. But by comparing with the same data year after year, it does seem like these trends do hold true. I also found early on that in two of 5 years of my work in Wyoming, the 5 years where I was in the field most intensively, up to 8 months a year, in 2 years, there was no breeding occurring population-wide. And this was based on the fact that none of the birds I trapped had brood patches, none of the birds of the 76 birds I radio tagged overall, none of the birds during those 2 years built nests. And in those 2 years, no fledglings were seen anywhere, even though we were spending hundreds of days in whitebark pine habitat. Now, this is correlation, not causation, but we know that in the 2 years where there was no breeding population-wide, both of those years followed a very low whitebark pine cone crop the previous autumn. Once again, this is correlation, not causation. It's a pretty small sample size. It would be great to see if this holds true over a longer time period. We also don't know if this is common elsewhere or if it's common historically, nor do we know if the proportion of years with non-breeding is changing at all. It's possible that nutcrackers may be viewing years with a higher whitebark pine cone crop as lower because there are fewer trees, which means there are fewer cones, even if each tree has more cones. We also don't know how many non-breeding years it would take before there would be a large impact on the population. These are pretty long-lived birds. And so if this is occurring more often than it was before, there could be a lag effect and we wouldn't notice for many years. One of the things I'm trying to do right now is just collect at least anecdotal reports of juvenile occurrence, which juveniles are pretty easy to see because they're loud and they're often really curious and really noticeable. So I'm trying to collect data on juvenile occurrence to see if I can at least use that presence data to look at whether or not juveniles are occurring in years with low whitebark pine cone crops in some areas. We also know from Chris Ray et al.'s 2020 work that more dead whitebark pines sometimes leads to less nutcrackers. I was happy to be a co-author in this study where Chris Ray from the Institute for Bird Populations looked at how nutcracker counts and nutcracker population was changing in several national parks in relation to how whitebark pine health and other whitebark pine variables were changing. And she did find that in Mount Rainier, as crown kill of whitebark pine increased, nutcrackers decreased. However, this did not hold in North Cascades National Park. Some earlier studies also have found that a high likelihood of nutcracker occurrence and seed dispersal is related to the amount of cones per hectare in an area. Sean McKitty, working in the Northern Divide, Bitterroot Mountains in the Greater Yellowstone, found that a high likelihood of nutcracker seed dispersal occurred at a threshold of 1,000 cones per hectare or more, and that this was met by a whitebark pine basal area of greater than 5 meters squared per hectare. Behringer et al. Used a different model, but similar methods overall, and found that there was a high proportion of observation hours of the nutcrackers at the same threshold, 1,000 cones per hectare or more, but this was met by about 2 meters squared per hectare. But when she plugged her data into McKinney's model, she found that McKinney's model underpredicted the number of nutcrackers she was seeing. Also, Teresa Lorenz found that when she plugged some of her data from the Cascades into McKinney's model, it kept predicting 0 nutcrackers in locations where a lot of her radio tagged birds were caching all of their seeds. I tested McKinney and Behringer's models in the Greater Yellowstone as well. I did this by going out and surveying over 3,000, by carrying out over 3,000 occupancy surveys at 238 random points over 5 years in the Greater Yellowstone. If you look at the map, all those gray diamonds are the points where I conducted surveys. I did these surveys in sets of 3 to incorporate detectability, which the previous studies hadn't done. And I think that helped better get at a more accurate understanding of nutcrackers, of how many nutcrackers were actually available or whether or not they were actually occurring in an area. Most of you probably have some familiarity now with Mackenzie's occupancy modeling and detectability. It's become more and more prevalent in the last handful of years. But basically by doing repeat surveys, we're actually able to use occupancy modeling to figure out how many nutcrackers were there, even if we didn't see them. And when I plugged my naive data prior to accounting for detectability using occupancy modeling, when I plugged this naive data from the fall seed harvest season into McKinney's model and then Behringer's model on the left and the right respectively, I found that both models underpredicted the number of nutcrackers at a location. Now, the only reason I am dwelling on this a little bit is because this 1,000 cones per hectare number has been included and used in many management strategy documents that I've seen recently. And I think the number needs to be used with caution. I think it's better to have, it's easy to have a number and it's easy to have a simple number. And I certainly think it's better to plant more whitebark pine trees versus less. And it's better to aim high. But I think there might be other things that are more important than this basal area or number of cone threshold that managers might want to consider. With the data that I collected with the occupancy surveys, what I found was that the presence of cones seemed to be much more important than the density of whitebark pine cones. So I didn't find any threshold at all. It just seemed like if there were any cones at all, that was much more important. In fact, in the late summer, when nutcrackers were harvesting immature whitebark pine seeds and eating them. And in the fall harvest season, when they were harvesting and caching mature seeds, the presence of cones was more important than density, 7 to 9 times more important during the late summer, and the presence was 6 to 43 times more important than density during the fall. The other than the presence of cones, the other most important variable that did predict nutcracker occurrence was the area of whitebark pine in the landscape. What my models were showing is that presence of cones and then amount of whitebark pine was hugely important. And I found that when you looked at cones per hectare, as the number of cones increased, occupancy probability stayed pretty much the same or even slightly decreased during the late summer and fall harvest when you held the area of whitebark pine at a median number. But I don't know if you guys can see those gray Bayesian credibility levels, but they're showing the variability of nutcracker occupancy actually increased as cones increased. So the probability of nutcrackers being in a location was high regardless at this median area of whitebark pine, no matter what the cones were, but the variability changed. And I think that variability is important because having higher variability of nutcracker occurrence when there's lots of cones means that the cone harvest season could last a lot longer. And there might be more than enough seeds to hide and not later consume versus more seeds being consumed earlier on. And then I found that as the area of whitebark pine increased, occurrence probability slightly increased and then leveled off in both the late summer and fall, but that there was much higher variability of occurrence at low amounts of whitebark pine. So basically, the more whitebark pine there was in the landscape, just the more likely there are nutcrackers and the lower variability. And that's what we want, is more nutcrackers and lower variability. So we found that the presence absence was a strong predictor of occurrence, but also the area of whitebark pine within 32.6 kilometers. I used that 32.6 kilometer to be the landscape because that was the longest we've seen nutcrackers. Teresa had seen nutcrackers travel in order to harvest and cache seeds. And this is basically saying that if managers want to have a high probability of nutcrackers, at least in the greater Yellowstone, it would be important to have a minimum of 12,500 to 25,000 hectares of whitebark pine within this 32.6 kilometer range of whatever location they're considering restoring. So one would want to take basal area into account. It's important to have cone-bearing trees in order to have nutcrackers present, and then therefore the potential for seed dispersal possible. But just increasing the basal area or number of cone-bearing trees may not help if there's not enough whitebark within 32.5 kilometers of a point. So I also found that the amount of Douglas fir in the landscape was important. And I only looked at this within 3.6 kilometers, which is the median breeding season home range, which is much smaller than the rest of the year. I'll get back to that in a second on the next slide. But I also, just to reiterate, I did not find that the density of cone crop mattered, nor did I find that whitebark pine importance value or Douglas fir importance value was a predictor of nutcracker occupancy. Importance value and basal area were highly correlated. Importance value basically was a combination of relative basal area frequency and density all in one number. It's a pretty standard in a lot of forestry studies. So one of the things I feel like I've been harping on for years is that I think that managers should consider the mosaic, the habitat mosaic that whitebark pine is in when they decide where to focus their restoration efforts. In the greater Yellowstone, where there's mainly whitebark pine, a little bit of limber pine, it's pretty scattered, it's pretty sparse, and it's dying for a lot of the same reason, for these same reasons as whitebark pine. There's whitebark pine, limber pine, and then Douglas fir, but primarily Douglas fir and whitebark pine are the main food sources for nutcrackers. It seems like Douglas fir is very important. What you're looking at here is how occurrence probability of nutcrackers changes as the area of Douglas fir increases. And these three graphs showing this have the same X and Y axes, because what changes is the amount of whitebark pine in the landscape. So at a minimum amount of whitebark pine in the landscape, the occurrence probability of nutcrackers increases with Douglas fir and then levels off, but the variability is enormous. Once you reach the middle graph, which is the mean amount of whitebark pine on the landscape, or C, which is the max amount of whitebark pine, as the area Douglas fir increases, the occupancy probability of nutcrackers increases and then levels off, and the variability is much lower. And this is basically showing that at locations with a moderate amount of Douglas fir and a high amount of whitebark pine is better. In fact, the only places where we had no nutcrackers at all were in places where there was no Douglas fir and no whitebark pine on the landscape. So the importance of Douglas fir has been found before and recently in a few different studies. In my radio tracking, I found that Douglas fir was highly selective for both pre-harvest home ranges and the breeding season home ranges. And then also Williams et al. In 2020 found that Douglas fir was particularly important for non-foraging purposes for habitat in Colorado. This wasn't whitebark pine habitat. This is where there was limber pine and ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. And he found that nutcrackers were common in Douglas fir stands regardless of the Douglas fir cone count. Also, what I learned recently, something I learned recently, which I'm fascinated by, is that Clayson suggests that the northern range of whitebark pine is actually limited by the northern limit of Douglas fir. She suggests that because Douglas fir doesn't go any further north, even though nutcrackers are capable of flying further north in the whitebark pine range, and the whitebark pine is capable of surviving further north, nutcrackers aren't bringing whitebark pine seeds further north because there's no Douglas fir available as an alternative food. So I guess to emphasize here, the reason I'm focusing on this is because I think there's very little mention of non-whitebark pine habitat in whitebark pine management strategies, which makes sense. It's a lot easier to manage at a stand level versus a landscape scale. And it's much easier to manage just one type of species versus multiple species. But I think this mosaic does need to be considered. So just as a quick side note, I also found that the detectability of nutcrackers during these occupancy surveys changed quite drastically once I plugged everything into the occupancy models, and found that as you move throughout the year, nutcrackers are much more detectable. So one needs to be cautious in comparing observations early in the year versus late in the year. Now, I'm convinced that all of these past studies, including my own, have the basic fault of that they're all in-person surveys that are capturing this tiny piece of time when these particularly when these nutcrackers are moving over such a large range and have such low detectability at times. And I'm convinced that ARUs, these automatic recording units, are one of the best ways to move forward in trying to figure out what habitat variables are really important to a high predictability of nutcracker occurrence. And so we started a project in 2020 with Central Washington University I'm in collaboration with Teresa Lorenz and Allison Scoville and Allison's great students to put ARUs throughout the Cascades in Washington. In 2020, we put ARUs, these automatic recording units, at 12 sites for 906 days of data. And then in 2021, we put these ARUs at 32 sites, including the same 12. Also, Vlad, who introduced me today, has been putting these ARUs out in Glacier National Park. And I am excited to see if we end up with similar or vastly different results because we're working with such different habitats. So what we've looked at so far is only the 2020 ARU data. And this was a year with a very low whitebark pine cone crop. One of our amazing students, Lauren Taraka, who did her senior thesis, actually manually went through all 906 days of data and figured out time to detection for nutcrackers if there were nutcrackers there. So we have presence absence per day, and then we have time to detection. Just to give you a sense of how much data we have, this chart on top shows all 12 sites, and then each dot shows a day where we had data. And you can see in the lower left-hand figure that in many locations, the nutcrackers were generally absent, all white, or half absent, half present, half white, half blue. But as the year went on, between July and October, often nutcrackers moved into a site. Now, in our very preliminary results, we found that the only variable so far that seems to be impacting the probability of a nutcracker moving into a site where it wasn't previously is Douglas fir on the landscape. And the only variable predicting nutcrackers moving out of a location where it currently is date. And the reason date might make sense is that it correlates with the whitebark pine cones and other cones maturing and then disappearing from the landscape after they're all harvested. Now, briefly, I'm going to switch gears and I want to talk a little bit more about the satellite tracking, which I started in 2014 and have been working on ever since in bits and pieces. There are many times since then that I've just put it on hold and kept collecting data where I've worked on other things. But this is what I'm most excited about right now. And in the satellite telemetry, my main objectives are to figure out nutcracker seasonal home ranges and core use areas, long distance movements, habitat selection, and then eventually create resource selection function maps from this data. It's so exciting to have this satellite trackers out, because when we were radio tagging, like I said, I had radio tagged 76 nutcrackers in the greater Yellowstone, and several of the birds just disappeared. When they disappeared, we didn't know if they're in the next mountain range over or if they had gone to Canada. But with these satellite tags, we're able to follow the birds wherever they go. So these are also very expensive. So I don't have many out so far. We put 7 out in Wyoming in 2014, 7 in Washington in 2018, and I'm going to come out in March and put 6 more on, almost doubling the number in Washington. And to date, or as of September 10th, 2021, we have 21,486 high quality locations. We've found that the Washington birds, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the Washington birds have stayed in the same general area the entire time. And one of those birds is still transmitting 3 years and 11 months later. Whereas in Wyoming, all of the birds stayed in the same area the first year. And then in a subsequent year, at least 4 of the birds went to Utah. 3 of them returned the next year after overwintering. 1 of them went offline, so I don't know if it came back. And then 1 of them went to Montana. So the birds in Wyoming seem to be moving quite a bit more. Just to, once again, to give you a sense of the spread of points, these gray areas are the harvest seasons. After the harvest season, in the middle of winter, the birds tend to go offline. And sometimes they go offline and come back, but we do have these big data gaps. So prior to the satellite tagging, this top figure shows the estimated home range sizes from the radio tracking studies from Teresa Lorenz in Washington and myself in Wyoming. And I put everything on the same scale. So, which is why these boxes look so small. But our estimates were pretty small, other than Teresa's Washington harvest season estimate. And that's the only one here that's a minimum convex polygon. Everything else is all 95% kernel home range sizes. But one of the biggest things that I found with the satellite tracking is that there's a huge variability between years, between individuals, between locations, Wyoming versus Washington. But the maximum home range size is enormous. In Wyoming during the harvest season, the maximum home range size was 41,000 hectares. And in Washington, the largest home range size was during the non-harvest season. That was about 25,000 hectares. And putting that in perspective, that's about 9% of North Cascades National Park. These birds, at least in some years, at some times, are using a huge area. And it's possible that that maximum size is more important than the average or the median, because if in some years they need that much, then they need that much. So one of the exciting things I've been looking at recently is how individual home ranges change. This individual right here, 171,448, you can see in this middle larger figure all the different season year combinations. So for example, the purple is during the harvest season in 2020, and then the other ones show either harvest or non-harvest seasons in other years. And in the upper right-hand side, the harvest season during a moderately high cone crop is the light blue. The following non-harvest season, they expanded a little bit. Same thing, the following year, moderate cone crop, they used a relatively small area. Then the following non-harvest season, they expanded a little bit to eat other foods. But then during a low cone crop, this purple, you can see this purple polygons, they moved over a much larger area during the harvest season, during a year with a low whitebark pine cone crop, which makes perfect sense. But we actually found that it wasn't always intuitive what we were seeing. For example, this red polygons on this other individual, 171450, the individual moved over the largest area in a year in the non-harvest season following a moderate cone crop. And this could just be because it seemed to be moving back and forth between two locations, not using the area in between, and potentially it was considering switching to this new range, which it eventually did. I found that happened regularly with the radio tracked birds as well. But also in a subsequent year, it had a much larger harvest home range, even during a year with a moderately high cone crop. So we don't know what's causing some birds to move over larger areas than others. We do know, and sorry for all the words, I was just working on this the last couple of days. I don't have pretty pictures. But we do know that cone crop is a significant predictor of Washington's 95% and 50% harvest and non-harvest season home ranges. But in Wyoming, cone crop is only a significant predictor of the 95% kernel non-harvest season home ranges, not the 50% kernels, not the harvest season. What was intuitive and made sense, which followed my hypothesis, was that during the Washington harvest season, the biggest home ranges were during the lowest cone crops, which makes sense. You would assume that they would have to move over a larger area when there's lower cones. But during the non-harvest year, the biggest home ranges were during seasons which followed moderate cone crops. I'll be really curious to see how individual home range habitat composition varies with these decisions. Like if birds have home ranges with a lot more Ponderosa pine or Douglas fir or a lot more whitebark pine, how does that change along with their home range size during different seasons? Now, briefly, some of you have probably seen this before, but we do know, like I said, that the Washington birds were not moving, but that the Wyoming birds seem to move pretty far. 71% of the nutcrackers in Wyoming that were satellite tagged moved out of the region in 1 year, and at least 3 of those 5 birds came back. I also know when I radio tagged birds in 1 year, 7% of the birds disappeared during a moderate cone crop and 71% during a high cone crop. When they moved to places with pinyon pine, Douglas fir, Ponderosa pine, limber pine. So they were moving to places without whitebark pine. And one of the things I think that's really important here is these birds might be moving over a larger landscape much more often than we realize. And I don't know what the threshold is. Nobody knows what the threshold is that makes certain individuals leave or switch strategies between years. Why would they stay 1 year and leave the next? Why would they choose to come back? But if we can attempt to get at some of those answers, it might help in us understanding whether or not nutcrackers plan to stay in an ecosystem or whether or not we should assume that they'll be leaving unless we do something. And yes, Washington, no long distance dispersal. So the question is, why have we seen such a difference between the Wyoming and Washington birds so far? We do need more data. We only have a sample size of 14. But I think one of the main reasons is there are Ponderosa pines in Washington. Ponderosa pines provide this alternative, really great seed source. And the other possibility, which Teresa Lorenz had mentioned, and which I've been mulling over for a while, is potentially there's more feeders in Washington. The population of people has gone up quite a bit in Eastern Washington in the past several decades. And you probably know that the number of people feeding birds has gone up quite drastically during the same time period. And so it's possible that a lot of the birds are depending on feeders a lot more often. This is something I'd like to eventually get at with eBird data. Now, briefly, this is very preliminary habitat selection results. I was hoping to show you more, but as with a lot of stats analysis, this stuff takes a lot of time. But I think this initial habitat selection info results are really interesting. So this is just Washington the first year, both harvest and non-harvest season, and it's a year with a moderately high whitebark pine cone crop. And the most interesting piece here that I found is that on average, the birds only selected for Douglas fir and Ponderosa pine habitats together. All individually, and then on average, they positively selected for Douglas fir and Ponderosa pine. They selected it more than it was available in the landscape. But on average, the birds only selected Douglas fir on its own, Ponderosa pine on its own, or whitebark pine on its own, In proportion availability. If there's more whitebark pine, they selected more whitebark pine. If there's less Ponderosa pine, they selected less Ponderosa pine. And then when you look at the individuals on the right-hand side, it's really interesting because it seems like it's half and half. Like individual strategies are really different. It seems like it shows that half of the birds selected whitebark pine more than was available in the habitat, and then half of the birds selected whitebark pine less than it was available. So these individual strategies may make a huge difference as to what we're seeing and what nutcrackers need. Having more data from future years of data that I already have being plugged into the analyses, and then these future satellite tags that we'll be putting on is going to help give us a better idea of what I'm seeing as an anomaly or if it's really just this variable. But I think this leads to the idea that this habitat mosaic is really important to Clark's nutcrackers, not just the whitebark pine itself. And then I'm about at my half an hour mark. Thank you to everyone who's made this possible all of these years. And a huge thank you in particular to my primary collaborators, Teresa Lorenz, Allison Scoville, Peter Singleton, and Jason Ransom, plus Seattle City Lights and my other funders for being so patient over these last few years, being a single mother with a young child, and on top of coronavirus, on top of COVID, has made things take a little bit longer than would be ideal. But soon I'll have more data to share with you all. If you guys have any questions, I would love to hear them, or if you have any other information that I did not include, please let me know. And then here's my website and email if you have anything after.
Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Schaming. And we're going to start with the first round of questions. So John Van Gundy says, in the field, I've rarely found multiple stem Ponderosa or Western white pine seedlings. Does this possibly mean that nutcrackers eat the seed instead of caching?
Yes, I think I got that. So nutcrackers will both eat whitebark pine seeds and cache whitebark pine seeds. And the reason they're caching them is so they have food to survive over the winter.
Thank you. Chris Frey says, do the different habitat selection strategies align with the sex of these birds or the age?
What's that?
So Chris Frey says, if the different habitat selection strategies align with the sex or the age of the birds.
I don't know. I know all of these birds were adults. They're not juveniles, but beyond that, I don't know what their age is. And I actually have all of their blood sitting in my house, and I would love to figure out what the sex is. I just have not funded that yet, but I plan to.
Thank you. Hannah Alberson says, do Clark nutcrackers catch and eat lodgepole pine seeds?
As far as we know, no. There's been a handful of times over the years you'd see a nutcracker on a lodgepole pine seed kind of banging away at a cone, but it almost seems like it's just they see a cone and they want to eat it. I've never saw them actually extracting seeds from a lodgepole pine cone, and so it almost seemed like they landed on a branch and there's a cone there, so they figured they'd hit it a few times. But no, they don't eat lodgepole pine seeds, nor do they cache them.
Okay. Robin Garwood says, if there is any evidence that Clark nutcrackers use or need subalpine fur.
No. In my radio tracking work, which is biased because when the birds were out of range, it is 30 kilometers line of sight range that you have. But if the birds are, like, say, on another side of a mountain, they're out of line of sight. So the radio tracking data is biased. You're not collecting all of the locational points that would be ideal to collect. But I did look at whether or not subalpine fir habitat was selected for or against, and everything just seemed to show that it was either not selected, either purposely avoided, or it was selected just in terms of availability. Like, they don't seem to be using it any more or less than non-seed producing trees that they like to eat seeds from.
Okay.
They do use it for habitat, though. You do see them perching regularly in subalpine fir trees, and I have seen nests in subalpine fir trees.
Okay. So Susan March says, regarding the Wyoming birds going to southern Utah, is there any concern that the shining of pinyon juniper on BLM lands is enough to create a problem for the long-running Clark nutcrackers?
As far as I know, there's no evidence of it. I don't know enough about what is going on with the populations of pinyon pine or any of these other species down in Utah. I had gone to all of those locations where those 4 birds overwintered, and at that time, they're pretty healthy habitats. I haven't published that data yet, but it does seem like if these greater Yellowstone birds are regularly traveling back and forth to these other habitats and those other habitats are declining, this could be a problem. We don't know if the nutcrackers will then just go somewhere else, or if that would lead to some kind of a decreased fitness because they'd be traveling to multiple locations and not settling down.
Okay. We receive another question, says, is there any evidence of nutcrackers that solely relied on alternate seed sources such as Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir and not whitebark?
Yes. So we know that many nutcrackers live in locations without whitebark pine. Like all of those nutcrackers in the southern half of the range are in locations without whitebark pine. And in those places, they're using limber pine, Ponderosa, pinyon pine, depending on where they are. Also, Therese Lorenz found with her radio tracking data in the Cascades in Washington that some of her radio tagged birds who were in a region with whitebark pine never used it. They were only using Ponderosa pine.
Okay. There's another question that says, did you say that you found no minimum threshold for whitebark pine density for nutcracker presence? Does this mean any cone-bearing trees will attract nutcrackers to harvest?
So what I found was that as long as there were cones, even if it was very, very, very few cones, nutcrackers would be there. In either there was a non-zero probability of nutcrackers coming, or I regularly would see nutcrackers, or I would see those big, they look like monster bites out of a cone, evidence of nutcrackers having been there. And this has been found, nutcrackers at stands with very low cones, has been found in Glacier National Park by Monica Meyer. It's been found by Behringer in her work in the Northern Divide in Yellowstone. It basically, as long as there are any cones, nutcrackers seem to come. But what I did find was that the amount of whitebark pine in the landscape seems to make a difference. So I suspect if there's a mountaintop with a whitebark pine tree or a few whitebark pine trees, and it's over 32 kilometers or 40 kilometers or whatever that actual threshold is, if it's far enough away, nutcrackers aren't going to make it there. So there has to be more whitebark pine around for them to be flying through to see them.
So another question says, is there any information about the habitat importance of subalpine fir and the impacts of daylighting whitebark?
As far as I know, there is no evidence that subalpine fir is important necessarily. It does grow, I know, in the Greater Yellowstone in combination with whitebark pine. So it seems like if all of the whitebark pine or all of the subalpine fir disappeared, that would certainly change something. Whether or not nutcrackers will care, I don't know. No, I don't. As far as the daylighting, I believe that's so you're referring to whether or not it makes sense to open areas around whitebark pine to encourage nutcracker caching. If so, evidence seems to show that nutcrackers don't really care. And I would be happy for somebody to argue with me about that. But it seems like nutcrackers are caching in all different kinds of habitats, in open areas, in cliff areas, in big open fields and burned areas, but they're also caching in really dense forest, and they're caching above ground, below ground. It doesn't seem like daylighting would help increase nutcracker caching. It may help whitebark pine germination, which is something totally different, and that alone might be worth doing it for.
Okay, and one last question says, within your experience, what's one of the coolest thing you've seen in the field for your research?
One of the coolest things I've seen, I have to say, just that feeling when you're out there in the fall and you're surrounded by hundreds of nutcrackers, and they're all loud and they're all raucous and they're all calling back and forth to each other, and their sublingual pouches are full of seed, noticeably full of seeds, and they're just flying very fast. You can hear the sound of their wings. It sounds different when they're flying these long distance flights versus when they're flying from tree to tree. But you're hearing these long distance flights, and you're watching these nutcrackers just hustling to get as many seeds harvested as possible. It's pretty dramatic and exciting.
That's for sure true. Thanks so much for your time again, Dr. Schaming. And in behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, I want to thank everyone for participating. Today we had over 100 participants. That's really cool. And today's video recording will be posted soon on the webpage of the foundation. And remember to save the date for our next webinar session on next February the 15th. We will be having Lorinda Bollington with her talk on tree microbiomes manipulation and their influence on tree overall health and defenses. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.